Hello and welcome to the DME podcast, brought to you by DME, the podcast booking platform. Whether you're a podcaster or an aspiring guest, the DME app is a perfect platform for you to get booked and manage your podcast bookings. I'm your host, Sukhay, the founder of DME, and on this podcast we'll be discussing the latest news and views in tech, the ins and outs of entrepreneurship, and even dipping our toes into the adrenaline-filled world of mixed martial arts. In today's episode, we take a look into the world of diversity, equity and inclusion with Kulbir Shergill, Director of Social Inclusion at Warwick University. We explore how personal experiences and societal changes have shaped DEI policies from the mid-90s to present. Kulbir shares her journey through various sectors like public housing, criminal justice and the corporate environments, illustrating the evolution of DEI from a personal passion to a professional imperative. We discuss the nuanced differences between diversity, equity and inclusion, how these concepts are applied in real-world settings, and the ongoing challenges and successes in making our workplaces and communities more inclusive. So please join us as we unpack the complexities of bias, the importance of data-driven approaches, and what the future might hold for DEI in the UK and globally. Kulbir Shergill, welcome to the DME podcast.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, yeah, full disclosure, obviously we are related. Big sis. I know we haven't spoken in a while, but I'm always looking for new and exciting guests to come on the podcast. And I know diversity, equity, and inclusion has been in the news a fair bit recently, and it's been quite prominent in kind of cultural circles for the last 10 years. And you are my most prominent expert in that field. So I thought I'd ask you on and kind of get a little bit of background into your work in this area and kind of get an explanation, help me understand it a little bit more as well, if that's okay.
I shall do my very best, and you're so right. It's certainly been very prominent for good things and also very controversial things. But it's an issue that's forever kind of changing. Really, it doesn't stand still.
So why don't you take us through kind of your journey into this field? Kind of how did you start and what motivated you to kind of pursue this path? We should probably mention that your current position is as a Director of Social Inclusion at Warwick University.
Yeah, that's right, actually. Well, I've always worked in inclusion-related issues, actually, since I've graduated. And I guess my kind of motivation for this has been very much my upbringing, seeing the experience of my parents. You know, I grew up in the era of the National Front marching through Leicester, but also kind of observing what my parents' experience was as a child in terms of discrimination that they would have faced in, trying to get employment. I remember my dad telling me that he had to cut his hair. He was a Sikh, but he couldn't get a job until he took his turban off and cut his hair. So I think it was really those kinds of observations. And then obviously, you experience those things yourself. So it wasn't just all the kind of day-to-day behaviors, but as you kind of grow into adulthood, you realize that there is so much kind of discrimination embedded in the way that things get done, and that people get excluded, not just on grounds of race, but all kinds of, things that people get left out of opportunities. And so my first role actually was looking at the public housing sector and how the policy of local government impacted on the opportunity that people from ethnic minorities had in terms of applying and actually getting a council house, and then actually what their experience was in terms of the service that they got, but also then the living experience of them and their families in the houses that they would be allocated to in the areas that they lived, which weren't always kind of very pleasant. So that's where my career started, very kind of customer focused actually, but also looking at how public policy impacted on the lives of ethnic minorities.
Okay. So that's quite interesting. What were kind of your findings of that initial work? When are we talking there? Are we talking early 2000s or late 90s?
No, we're talking kind of early 90s, really. And, it was, there'd been quite a lot of research done in the housing sector, both in the public and private rented sector in particular, in terms of how difficult it was for ethnic minorities to access housing, because, for example, many local authorities had up until that point had policies where you could only apply for local authority housing if you had a local connection. So if you're somebody who's relatively new and you're moving to a city, it was, indirectly kind of discriminating against certain groups of people, in particular kind of ethnic minority people. So I think that was certainly there. And then in terms of how people made decisions, so it was who was looking at the application form and how they were making those decisions in terms of, was there a fair process, or were people making judgments about people? And that's where the personal bias would come in terms of who they felt deserved a council house. And I think in the past, that was very much how it was done. That's no longer the case. There's much more kind of guidance in terms of how people can apply and be allocated housing. But certainly when I first started working in housing, it was not that clear cut. And I can actually remember having to sit in on decision-making bodies when they would be looking at applications for housing or for transfers, where you would almost have to advocate on people's behalf in terms of why they needed that home or why they needed to kind of move elsewhere. So, and I think that's a piece around getting people to look at things differently and actually taking factors into account that they may not have to for other people.
So were those public policies that were in place, were they deliberate, or were they just a consequence of not adapting to a changing society fast enough?
I think they were probably a consequence of, the policy wasn't kind of reacting fast enough to how population was changing. However, in the private rented sector, and there have been many, many studies, and I think they've been repeated fairly recently, where there was quite blatant discrimination when people of colour would go and view a property, but somehow it would always have gone. Or they wouldn't be, the landlord wouldn't come back and say, you can have this property for rental. So there was direct discrimination there against people of colour. And there's lots of research that actually evidences that.
Okay. So kind of moving on then. So once you kind of worked in the housing sector, where did you move on to that? Was that transitioned into the academic world after that? Or?
No, actually, the university role is the first academic based role for me, actually. But I've worked in a number of different sectors, actually. One of the other key sectors that I worked in was the criminal justice area. So I worked for a fairly large national organisation that provided services, but also worked with key services like prison service, probation. So the Department of Justice would be the quickest way of putting it. And there, the role was looking at who kind of ended up in the criminal justice system and the biases that are built into that process, and, what kind of happens in prisons as well. And, what was kind of very clear there was that obviously people from, very deprived backgrounds, people who are poor, more likely to kind of end up being involved in crime, particularly young people. And also, you would see a lot of people who had learning difficulties, would quite often, or mental health problems. And I think during that time, we were also seeing an increasing number of women ending up in prison as well. And there are probably lots of different factors and shared factors for those different populations in terms of their experience of the criminal justice system. So that was one aspect of the work there. But then the other aspect was, what were the services that we were delivering to help young people not offend, or people who had been in prison to not reoffend. So that was a kind of, it was really interesting working there. I mean, personally for me, I felt like I learnt an awful lot about deprivation at the very sharpest end of our society. It's an area that people generally don't like to talk about. It's not something we just want to lock people out rather than understanding actually why people end up in prison, and actually what is it that we can change about society that would stop people ending up there in the first place. I mean, to be honest, our prison service is not really resolving the issues. We all know that there are huge problems there in terms of overcrowding, the lack of rehabilitation, etc. So that was another big area that I worked in. And then I've also kind of delved back into big housing companies in London, and then kind of moved into the corporate sector. So I worked for a number of corporate companies before I actually then came to the social, but back into the kind of more social sector of higher education, which has also been very different. So I've worked in very, very different sectors actually, but it's all been a learning experience, and there are kind of commonalities as well as being differences between them.
So how would you kind of define, I mean, the current buzzwords are diversity, equity and inclusion. I think you might term it as EDI. How are we defining those terms now, and who are they for?
I think, definitions around diversity and inclusion are a very personal thing and a very personal experience. But from a professional context, we talk about diversity as being different, and those differences can come in many forms. There are those differences that we're born with, whether that's our ethnicity, whether we might be born with a disability, or any other things that we are, born with. And then there are those diversities, characteristics that we acquire. So that might be things like where in the world we're born, even in the country where we're born, what accent you might speak to, where you went to school. So your life experiences shape the opportunities that sometimes you may have available or not available to you. And you may have kind of additional barriers that other people may not face because of those diversity characteristics. So that's how I would talk about diversity, and it comes in all kinds of forms. In terms of equity, I think equity for me is about fairness, and it's very much grounded in fairness of how things work. So that could be our systems, our processes, our policies, our laws, all of those things, in terms of how do they impact on different people, and what are the opportunities that people have or are stopped through things that inbuilt biases in those things. And the inclusion aspect, and for me, I think this is kind of one of the most important parts, is inclusion is about creating places, society, organizations where difference is welcomed and difference is valued. And actually we understand the benefits that diversity brings. And I like to talk about diversity of thought, because I think all those different aspects of our diversity characteristics really kind of give us a different lens on the world. We bring different experiences, we bring different ways of thinking, different ways of looking at things. And we know that when we want innovation and we want creativity, it's that diversity of thought that is really important.
Yeah.
So hence diversity of people is important. Otherwise you get groupthink. If we all think the same, we look the same, nobody challenges each other, we just go along, and do the thing. And we know that sometimes that leads to disaster because somebody is not looking at it with a completely different lens and not spotting something that somebody else may have. And people talk about that in terms of what happened with the banking sector. They say there was very much a kind of groupthink that led to kind of, a big kind of crash back in the 90s. But I think the other thing that we need to be aware of, that to make diversity work, you need to have inclusion. Because diversity itself can bring conflict, because actually we're very comfortable with things that we know. We're comfortable with the familiar. It's a kind of very natural human trait. So when we come across people who are very different to us, that can make us uncomfortable and it can make us defensive. And obviously that's not the thing that you want in the workplace. When you want people to work together as cohesive teams and you want people to be able to perform at their best, we need to have that kind of culture which actually helps people to welcome that diversity, understand it, I'll be curious about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the most controversial definition will be the equity one. So I think you defined equity as more as equal opportunities as opposed to equity of outcome, which I think is where the confusion between maybe both sides of the political aisle in terms of having this conversation comes in. I think some people define equity as equality of opportunities, others define it as equality of outcomes. And whereby that doesn't happen, they try to force it and make it happen. Is that something that you've come across or you've seen in your work?
Well, I mean, looking at the outcomes is just as important in this work, because looking at the outcomes helps you to understand whether the changes and interventions that you're making to make systems and processes fairer are actually working. Are they having the right outcomes? So for me, looking at the outcomes is thinking, if all things were equal, is this what you would expect? Or are there other factors here at place? So I don't know that people in our profession would try and force equal outcomes, because that may not always be appropriate. I think you need to put things into context, but it's about how you put those interventions into change and what we're allowed to do legally by law as well. And I think sometimes people confuse what used to be the law in the States. And I think there's always a lot of controversy around quotas, for example, which we aren't allowed to do legally here in this country and never have done. So what we talk about here is positive action. So we talk about what are the kind of changes, what do we need to do differently that would make that experience for people more of an equal experience. And a very simple example of that might be, what is the experience of going to an interview panel, for example, for a woman when she may be faced by an all-male panel? Is that something where she's going to feel comfortable, or is that going to make her feel slightly uncomfortable and feeling that she can't be herself, that she's relaxed enough to actually be able to hold that interview in the way that she might if she was kind of feeling very kind of relaxed with people. So that's why we talk about having mixed panels, of having more diverse panels. Although I don't think that is ultimately all the things that we need to have, because having a diverse panel in itself doesn't actually mean that everybody will be behaving in an unbiased way. The most important thing is that the panel understands how bias works and actually how their own decisions might be affected by bias. So I think there's a number of different factors that we need to take into account in terms of how we make systems fairer. But it may also be in terms of, what we ask for in terms of qualifications for jobs. It's going to be a very different experience for people.
Yeah. Well, that was kind of my initial thoughts is when you're dealing with humans, I always kind of say the variables are too grand to model or too grand to kind of account for in all the kind of policies or legislations or kind of rules that you're trying to put in place, because there's always somebody who falls in between the cracks and they thought, right, well, there's also this person, there's also that type of person, there's also this type of person, and we talk about fields and everyone feels different and you can't account for everything. So wouldn't a better definition, just a better rule for society or better legislation just don't discriminate? That would not make it simpler?
It is, and I think this is where the work around bias comes in, is actually kind of understanding that and understanding the decisions that you make. Are you making a decision about giving somebody a job? How are you judging that talent? And being honest about it. I think one of the challenges that we face as human beings, I think where we are for most people in society, is that we don't want to be biased. Actually, I don't think most people would want to be classified as being sexist or racist. And actually, when research is being carried out in this area, most people don't actually think that they are sexist or racist or biased in any way. But when experiments then carry on and people's actions are examined, this isn't actually carried out. So we're actually more biased than we think we are. So this is where can we think about how we're making the decisions and being aware in our own head, how am I judging this person?
Okay. So what does that research show? Does it show that people are actually being biased on immutable characteristics, or is it that something they're consciously doing, or is it very much a subconscious thing for most people?
I think it's probably a mixture of both. I think clearly in society, and we only have to look at the news, there are people who are very biased. They have very clear opinions, whether it's about women or whether it's about people of color or people of a particular religion. There are clearly biases and discriminations going on there. And then for other people, I think it's can be quite unconscious. It's just the way that they're used to doing things, or maybe assumptions, because our brains work incredibly quickly, and it builds up all this kind of experience. The number of decisions that are going on in our brain at any 1 minute is like millions of things that it's doing all the time. And then it builds up this experience. If we kind of take in information which says, women really aren't very good at this job, they're not really very good at maths, and so I couldn't possibly give them this kind of finance job, even though they're not thinking that, at the back of our brain somewhere is that kind of piece of information that may, if you're making an instant decision, may actually affect that decision. So one of the things that we say is think about the evidence that you're making this decision on. And then there are other factors that will also influence the outcome of things. If you're making decisions in a stressed or hurried way, you're more likely to make a decision without really thinking it through. So don't make those discussions when you're feeling under pressure or you're tired, because actually you won't really be functioning at your best.
Okay. And when you kind of delivered these policies or this feedback in the corporate setting or even a public policy settings, what's kind of the reaction from your target audience initially versus kind of when you've done working with them or kind of towards the end of your journey on that? Is it quite hostile to start with and then more receptive as you kind of soften them a little bit?
Yes, I think it can vary, actually. I mean, I think most people are actually very open to wanting to learn. But I think there is this piece that comes in where people do feel threatened or can feel threatened, because if you're saying, oh, we'd like you to come to a training course on, bias or sexual harassment or something, and your instant reaction would be, well, why am I being invited to this course? I haven't done anything wrong and I wouldn't do anything like that. So I think that's the instant reaction. But then thinking about, how people actually behave and what evidence tells us, it means that we do actually need to inform and engage people on these issues. So I think people can be, and I think it all depends on how it's done. I think in terms of how you engage people on these issues. So I think if you make people go to courses, and again, the evidence tells us if you make people go to courses, they're more likely to resent it. And actually, the impact of training in the way that it's traditionally been delivered is not long-term. The kind of learning curve falls very quickly, and that happens with any training, actually. So one of the things that we've been doing at Warwick is that we've switched from, saying to people, oh, here, watch this video or come to this 2-day training course. People don't have time and actually not really sure what the value of having that kind of training is. So we've introduced what we call micro courses, and these get delivered to every single member of staff. They're like 8-minute courses, and we deliver a number of those over the year so that we kind of get this constant reminder of things, but also it's very quick. People don't have to spend ages because naturally people are busy, and they have priorities, and training is always the thing that comes at the bottom of the pile. So I think it's thinking about how the training is delivered, why people think they're having that training, and actually the context of it. Is it relevant to the work that people are doing? I think there's been quite a lot of research which shows that, those are the things that people they get a bit fed up about, because they might say, well, how is that relevant to my job? So make it relevant,
Okay. So have you kind of seen from when you first started in the 90s to today, how have you kind of seen the evolution of EDI or DEI? Yeah, there we go. Get my acronyms messed up. But have you kind of seen the evolution? Where we started? I'm guessing it was quite resistant in terms of understanding what that movement is around and what that education journey is like versus today. Have we come a long way, or is there still some work to do?
Yeah, I think there's lots of names to start with, and I think people use different identities depending on who they are and who they're talking to. I mean, we talk about social inclusion actually, because I think one of the things here is very important is that it's about everybody actually. And I think that's one of the biggest moves actually. I think traditionally, and it still is, for some people in a lot of areas, a more of a focus on the differences between people rather than actually how do we work on this together? And I think that's one of the biggest moves that I've seen, is thinking about things in what we call an intersectional way, because none of us are two-dimensional. I'm just talk about myself. I'm a woman, but I am a woman of Indian origin. And I am an atheist, but I'm not just a woman of Indian. I'm not just somebody of Indian origin. There's different factors for myself as a human being, and it's really thinking about people as individuals, but also multidimensional. I think that's one of the biggest kind of changes that we've seen in this field, actually. And I think more people are engaged with it, actually. I think it's something that people talk about a lot more. The good and bad things, in a positive way or a negative way. In particular, you mentioned this at the beginning, the impact that certain politicians are actually having on this. You can't get away from that politics and economics impacts hugely on this area, and in terms of what's being talked about and how it's being responded to. So people do have very kind of different views depending on where they're coming from and what their own experience is. I think it's become a lot more professionalized. I think there's a real move away from just looking at maybe what people's experience is, but also having the data to back it up. And I think that for me is like a really big move, that we're much more focused on having data and evidence. And there's a lot more research in this area as well, in helping us to kind of understand why we're facing some of the issues and challenges that we are, but also thinking about what are the interventions that work or don't work, and how do we need to change this? I mean, I think in terms of kind of psychology and sociology and neurology, this is a kind of young area, thinking about how bias kind of impacts on society and between relationships. So there's still quite a lot of learning to be done, but I think it's moved from I guess maybe it seemed to me, certainly when I was in my, a child or whatever, it seemed more of a political movement. I'm not saying that it's not still, it certainly is, but from a work perspective, I think it's become much more kind of embedded. And I think we have a much more data and evidence-driven approach to it, and being very focused on the outcomes, particularly if you're working in an organization or a business, is how does it help to improve the business, and how does it help people who are working in that business?
So talking about businesses, and have you seen different attitudes and different levels of, shall we say, compliance across different industries? So is it, obviously must differ between the public and the private sector?
Well, I suppose our legislation is one of the biggest things that's different, because public organisations have the public sector duty, which is all about kind of promoting, inclusion and, diversity within the work that people do. And obviously that is not something that corporate sectors have to do. However, most corporate sectors actually recognise that that's an important part of the work in this area. I think that corporate sector, and maybe they have more funds to do it, that could be one of the things, have actually really recognised the importance of this in terms of developing talent, particularly around gender, and I think more latterly around race. But I think very much that movement started, around the gender issue of not having enough women in senior positions and on boards. And I think that's very much driven that agenda, which has kind of then expanded out to also then include other diversity areas such as ethnicity and disability, LGBT issues. And I think that it's kind of driven quite a lot of research, actually. I think that's what I found in the corporate sector, is that there was a lot more kind of access to research and data, because data is really important in those sectors. I find, in the public sector, we're not so good at doing that. It seems a little disjointed and clunky, but then you probably know about that from your own work.
Yeah, so I mean, working in the corporate environment, I have last few roles in big organisations I've worked for. I have seen, especially working closely with HR teams. Obviously, HR teams have a vast amount of data, and it's in their interest to kind of keep a track of people retention and their hiring practices and who they're hiring and where they're locating their businesses, to obviously pick from the local demographics of that area. But I also have seen this drive for kind of diversity in the corporate world as well. And they have specific roles within HR, specifically talking about inclusion, and those messages, they do come through. So I think it's the reaches have become quite broad, and it is quite industry wide now across all sectors. But I'm just wondering how you see kind of the future trends looking forward over the next, 10, 15, 20 years, both kind of in the UK and in the wider world as well. Do you see kind of EDI policies becoming more not pervasive, probably wrong word there, but more encompassing, or do you see some kind of contraction in those policies being implemented?
Well, if you look over in terms of what's happening in the States, you'd think, oh my goodness, it's going to be contracting, because there's all kinds of things that are happening right there. But even in the States, I think we have to kind of see that while some companies may be abandoning what they said were very much central to their values and their kind of objectives of an organization, equally there are big companies that are still carrying on. And Apple is an example, actually, of that. They recently their board voted that they would continue with their diversity policies because they see the value that it brings to the innovation and the people of the organization. I think inevitably there is a kind of sector of political activity which makes it an uncomfortable area, I think, for people, because there's more of there is a kind of real lens on it. So I feel that, people are curious, but you also feel like you're almost having to justify why you do what you do.
Yeah.
So I think there's going to be more of a lens on what's actually happening and what the outcomes are. That's not a bad thing, but I think it's also kind of understanding some of the motivations behind people who see it as a negative thing, and actually why do they see it as being so threatening? And some people would say that it's because some people who've always had more advantages than others certainly see this kind of work as being, putting them at a disadvantage. Whereas actually I would say, well, what it's doing is actually increasing the competition. You've just got tougher competition than you had before. So if you're as good as you say you are, you've got as equal chance as anybody else at succeeding at getting or doing whatever it is that you think you may not have as much chance as you had before. It's only your own abilities or not that will hold you back.
Yeah.
So I do see that there is a political piece here that will impact on what we're doing and how we do it. But I think that most companies actually recognize the benefits that this work brings to the innovation, the creativity, the kind of achievements of people. I mean, we see it as being very important to our students, for example, in terms of their student experience and actually what their final outcomes are. We know those get impacted by negative experiences. And I think that is the same for people in the working world. I think companies also recognize that their customer bases are not, that their customer bases are diverse, which means that they have to design products differently for different people, or very specific products for certain groups of people. And actually, you need that diversity of thought for companies to understand what it is that they need to do.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I was very aware of in the corporate sector is that those organizations were very aware of what their clients also expected and who their clients were. And, quite often being an organization that was inclusive and took all these things into context would be a selling point for them. So there are really, really good business reasons for people to continue doing this work, but also there are lots of reasons, humanitarian reasons about human beings and how we treat each other for carrying on doing this work.
Yeah. I mean, I'm all for kind of a free market approach. And I think ultimately for corporations, as long as they see the value of these policies and they see the value to the bottom line, ultimately that's what matters to them. So closing thoughts, if people wanted to follow your work a little bit further, because I know you write a lot about this area as well, where can they kind of find some of your writings and some of your research?
Well, you'll find some of the stuff on LinkedIn. You can also look on the Warwick University web pages. You can find the social inclusion pages, and you'll see a lot more of our work, what we're doing, what our kind of current challenges are, what's the data looking like, and, what are some of the successes as well. There's some wonderful work going on across the campus by all kinds of people, including the social inclusion team, and you can find out more about that there.
Awesome. Well, we'll link to all that in the podcast description. But Kulbir Shergill, thank you very much for coming on the DME podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.